Um, so we depend on domesticated species and they depend on us. So basically, you know, it's just a mutual understanding that we've kind of come to over time. You know, you're not going to find lettuce growing out in the wild, or corn. So it says, through most of human history, people had no explicit knowledge of genetics. They saved seeds or bred individuals with just the most desired characteristics. And then the genetic base of agriculture has narrowed as we've become dependent on just a few species and a smaller number of genetic combinations within that species. Crops lost their basis for pest and disease resistance and toleration for adverse environmental conditions. So the way that genetics change in nature, it's pretty much constantly changing. And that was kind of surprising to me because you don't really think about that because we have such a small view. You know, think of even like 80 years is really not that long. You're not going to see a whole species, you know, adapting. At least you probably won't notice it. But things are constantly changing, and natural selection has created the diversity that we find in nature. And adaptation is the correlation between the environment and the species traits. So this can enable them to better use resources, provide protection from environmental stress, the ability to modify their environment or facilitate reproduction. And like we were talking about earlier, this is a continuous process. So as environments change, plants and animals are constantly adapting, even though we're not necessarily going to notice it from season to season, or maybe even within our lifetime.
So you got to think in terms of kind of different kinds of change. Some is just the general change that happens in climate, right? And say our soil conditions. And then some is a larger scale changes, and the one that we're all concerned about right now, especially with genetics, is the climate change that we're seeing. So as climate changes, will we have the genetics to take and to grow food within those kind of new climate that we have? It's an important topic.
So variation in natural selection, the genotype is the genetic information of the individual, whereas the phenotype is the physical and behavioral expression of the genotype. And he talked about that any one characteristic has a range of variability, although there is an average. I think one of the examples he gave in the text was like tail length or something like that. You're going to have some variation, but it's going to be a window, and you're going to have an average in there somewhere. And mutations are errors in DNA replication. He said some are fatal or detrimental, some are neutral, and a few are beneficial, but all of these represent genetic variability. And
there
then,
is, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Ed, you're fine.
I was just going to, there's a new topic that's come out in the last 10 years, and it has actually a lot of application, and it's called epigenetics. And that means that an organism has a specific genetics, but not everything on that map really is expressed. And so it takes different environmental conditions to express it. Now, that could mean if you have one parent that had, say, a low nutritional environment, that could change the genetics that are expressed in the progeny to where they become more energy efficient. So that next generation may actually have problems with things like obesity and that kind of thing. Hello, Ashlyn. So epigenetics has become really important. And so what happens is it can express itself with a different set, that genetics, that genotype can express itself differently under different environmental conditions. And that's really a big leap in our understanding. The other thing I wanted to talk about here in this part is this issue called provenance or ecotypic variation. So when you talk about an average here, you might have an average for one location or another location, but the locations differ considerably in their adaptation to that environment or adaptiveness. And so what, for example, is we have a grass called blue grama. It grows from Mexico up into Canada, but you can't take blue grama from Mexico and grow it in Canada, right? They're just, that become the ecotypic adaptation or a variation in it makes it to where it can survive in one location but not another. But it's still the same species. And so it's really important that you take and get plants that are adapted to that particular area. Okay, so you get that ecotypic variation for that one location. And that becomes really important. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. And then he also defined natural selection as the process where environmental conditions determine which traits confer an advantage. And like Ed was just talking about, it acts on populations and not necessarily the entire species. So directed selection and domestication. Directed selection is when humans direct genetic change within agricultural populations. Domestication is managed reproduction until they unintentionally selected for useful traits. And the traits that we're selecting for right now, he gave some examples. Crops, we're selecting for yield, taste, appearance, harvesting ease, fertilizer and irrigation response, shipping ability, shelf life, and uniformity. And then with animals and livestock, we're selecting for docility, reproduction cycles, rapid growth, maximum production, which could be wool, eggs, pounds of milk, muscle tissue, any of that, any of those things.
Are there anything that happens? I mean, if you select for these traits, is there some things that happen that, say, for instance, animals, is there some things here that's not listed that changes with domestication? Are there some that you might not expect? Remember we talked about yesterday some of the changes in brains? So what happens is that domestication, things like animals' brains get smaller, their visual acuity and sense of smell will sometimes decrease. So we see that happening in cattle or sheep when you compare them to the native where they originated. So there's a lot of other changes that kind of occur with those selection pressures.
I used to work with a fox who was one of the genetic variabilities. Like he was bred one of the Russian domestic foxes, and we used to keep him with regular wild foxes, and he phenotypically was completely different in his expression. Like his physical traits were 110% different from the more wild varieties of foxes. It was interesting.
Yeah, it changes. There's quite a bit of work that's been done with those Siberian foxes.
Yeah.
In domestication. Yeah. Anybody else have questions about this, about selection pressures?
No, I'm good.
Is everything intentional? Do we make selection pressures? Is it all intentional? Do we do it, because we have some sort of goal in mind?
No, but one thing that I could add is that, like, I selected a bull for docility also, and I know one of the factors that comes in is that that can counteract how good of a mother that next generation will be.
There is some relationship between mothering ability and docility. And so if you have, one of the issues that we have with my cattle is the Mexican wolf has been reintroduced. So we don't really want an animal that's docile. We want one that's going to take and stick up for itself and for its calf. Anybody else have some examples? How about some planned examples? Anybody else? Brendan, do you have some examples?
There's examples in the book, finding the list currently. Talking about like virus like resistance, but then you could get a trait like with genetically modified, genetically engineered. You can have virus resistance, but with that you cannot expect or anticipate to get bacterial proneness. Is something that it mentioned.
There's another example for plants, and that is everybody has canola oil. You know about canola oil? Actually, it was called rape. It comes from what they call rapeseed. And so what they did is they bred, there's a toxin in rapeseed called erucic acid. And so they bred it for low concentrations of erucic acid. And then because they couldn't sell it to that oil very well because a name like rape, they changed the name and sold it as canola. But the issue now is that without that erucic acid, it was more susceptible to pests. And so they have more problems with it now. So they've taken and changed that by using more chemicals. Yep. So there's another one. But we see that a lot. Pumpkins and stuff have a lot of cucurbitacins in them, and what we've done is breed them so those concentrations are low because cucurbitacins are sour and bitter. So they've made an awful lot of changes.
And with like getting rid of those cucurbitacins, then as mentioned in the book, you have more herbivory, and then you have to rely more on pesticides and herbicides to keep off pests from your crops, and then you're building more pesticide, herbicide tolerant pests.
Exactly. That's a good observation. Yep. What about, so we kind of talked about that. Was selection though, was it always with something in mind, or how did selection happen before we had some scientific studies and we had, people who were trained in this?
Well, survival of the fittest, yeah.
Okay, that's one. But what about people? We do the selection, yeah.
Well, like if you were like a fur trader or something and you were raising rabbits for fur, so you would select the more like spotted ones or the more beautiful pelts or whatever to breed.
Okay. So what plants you select, you might take the seeds from a good plant and save those, right? And share them with your neighbors. So it was a lot slower, but it happened over time. And one of the things that's changed with domestication is a lot of the plants we have now that are annual, like wheat and barley, they were perennial. Corn was the same thing. It was a perennial corn, Zea diperenne. And as we domesticated it, those plants tend to become annual in nature. And so that's an issue. And of course, one of the things that's happening right now is that a few scientists are trying to take and go back to what they call perennial polyculture, trying to give wheat so that it lasts for several years instead of something that we need to seed every year. So, but yeah, selection happens a lot of different ways. It's really interesting about some of those selection pressures. Do we have everything here, Rachel?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we were pretty much just talking about this, but mass selection is collecting seed from favorable individuals, and it creates a gradual shift, and it also produces land races, which I thought that I updated this slide, but it must not have. updated. So mass selection is more similar to natural selection. And so you're retaining adaptation to local conditions as well as the things that you're selecting for. And then hybridization is a cross between two very different purebred parents. And I think we talked about this quite a bit in livestock last fall, but it creates hybrid vigor, primarily in the first generation. So, you know, once, as you continue crossing, you're going to lose that.
Okay. Hybridization is just about what we were doing, right, when we were talking about using hybrid vigor in cattle. So when we take two different breeds and we cross them, and then we see about a 20% improvement in the first generation, the F1 generation. That is hybridization. And so we see the same kind of things in plants. It's really interesting, the history of hybridization and use in agriculture was by a guy by the name of Henry Wallace, who was the Secretary of Agriculture under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was also Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president. He was a very progressive man, and they came, and because he was so progressive, a lot of people were afraid of him, and so they came in and replaced him with a guy by the name of Truman, because they were afraid of what he might do. But if you ever get a chance to read the biography of Henry Wallace, you might find it really interesting.
So transgenic modification. So genomics is a single gene from one organism to a completely unrelated organism. And they also have the ability to create synthetic genes or genetic sequences that can also be utilized. And he lists a whole slew of potential drawbacks. So unintended consequences or results, like Brennan was talking about earlier, accelerating pest evolution, accelerating herbicide resistance, creating super weeds, introducing toxic agents or allergens into the food supply, genetic pollution, harm to wildlife and beneficial species, and consolidation of genetic material and resources.
Can anybody give us some examples of some of these drawbacks?
Well, that curly dock now is considered a super weed, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. It's really hard. You can't spray it with that glyphosate.
There's a lot of small farmers getting sued by Monsanto for like cross-pollination and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a different subject, but that's true. Has to do with being able to own genetics.
Yeah.
Then the almond, the spraying of the pesticides on the almond flowers, leading to the bees and the colony collapse.
That I don't know about. I knew that there were some problems with bees and almonds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and homunculus problems, because you have, you know, the breeding of superworms basically over time that haven't been, you know, when people were mass deworming their animals, and then now we have superworms because of it. So the strongest were the ones that survived, bred, and then they bred resistance to all the wormers that we have now.
Excellent example. Excellent. Yeah. Any others?
I know up here with the salmon farms up here, there's been issues with like some of the genetically engineered salmon escaping the farms and contaminating the wild river salmon population up here in Pacific Northwest.
And they grow so fast, they require a lot more feed to do that. And so they're really worried about the survival of the salmon with that new genetics in them.
Yep.
Yeah. And, you know, we knew that they would escape, but apparently they never heeded it. Yep.
No, that's
Yep.
Costco.
How about Lizzie? Do you have some examples?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, I
Jennifer?
was muted. I'm listening though.
Okay. Jennifer, you have an example?
No, I've just been listening to everything along the same, track, the super weeds and everything. I don't have a specific plant though.
Ashlyn, what about you? Nope. Okay. Okay.
So the loss of genetic diversity, he defines agrobiodiversity as the genetic diversity in nature. And there are basically two ways that we're seeing this loss. One is the genetic component itself, so the differences among organisms. And the second is the geographic component. So how these differences are arrayed spatially. And there are a couple of those that he mentions. So geographically, we can look at worldwide populations, regional and national, and down to the farm level. And genetically, we're looking at food types overall, specific species, and then differences within a breed or variety.
Can you give us some examples?
Me? Or
Anybody.
anyone?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
What's some examples? How about you, Rachel? You have some examples with cattle, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And I mean, the one that comes to my mind offhand is the Suffolk Punch draft horse. So they're doing a big effort over in the UK to preserve this breed. Even though there are quite a few here in the United States, they're just different. And they're different genetically, even though they were originally imported. The same thing with the old spots that we raise, even though they were all imported, I think back in the 80s, they're two different registries, and you can't really cross-register. So if they go extinct in the UK, they would have to come to the US stock, but they really don't want to do that. They'd like to keep UK stock and US stock and then have a mix of those as well. So basically, kind of like creating hybrid vigor within a particular breed, of keeping these two strains separate and also knowing when to intermix them to keep enough genetic diversity to keep the whole system alive.
The book, it had a real example of potatoes, which I found kind of appalling. Like, it didn't really recognize the systematic oppression of genetic diversity loss. Like, that was used as a tool throughout history, making people rely. The potato famine, particularly, was not an accident. If anybody is familiar with that, it was a systematic oppression of the Irish people. There was no allowance of any other seeds for the Irish people in that time. England refused to give them any relief aid. And it's happening again in India, where we see, after the Green Revolution, and in Mexico with the suicide belt of India, where farmers are drinking Roundup because they are so relied on Monsanto for their seeds year to year. And that's just another systematic oppression of people through seeds.
Yeah, yeah. Right, okay. Anybody else?
What about bananas?
Oh, bananas. That's a good one. Do you know about that? Tell us about that, Lizzie. Do you know?
All I know is that there's only like one variety, or like one, there's no biodiversity. It's just like one type of banana, and it's not open pollinated, so they have to just clone them. Is that right?
Yeah, they're clonal, right? Mm-hmm. Cavendish banana, right? That's what we depend on mostly. Gabe, you had a comment, I think.
Oh, it's two types of bananas. It's the Standish and the Cavendish, but that's
Right. But there's a lot more plantanos and stuff out there.
Yeah.
It's just that we've used that one because it is clonal. The amount that there's just hardly any diversity out there. And so is it a rust that's affecting them now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the rust, is just kind of moving across the globe right now. They expect that we're going to lose a lot of the bananas. I notice we have some similar things with coffee right now too. Yep. Anybody else have some examples?
Yeah, apples.
Apples. There used to be a lot of different kinds of apples.
Yeah, and
yeah.
Especially like I saw it a lot when I lived in Boone. There was this one farmer at the farmers market, and he had like 30 different kinds of apples.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the main grocery stores, you just see like 2 different kinds of apples.
Yeah. And you know, the delicious it used to be delicious. It's not much anymore, is it? Yeah. Yeah. Shall we move on, Rachel?
Sure.
Okay.
So this is pretty much what you guys were just talking about. He listed off a lot of really pretty amazing statistics. And I'm a kind of a numbers junkie, so I love to learn that way. So I felt inclined to include them. So he said that 60% of our dietary energy comes from just 4 crops, which are wheat, rice, corn, and potatoes. 70% of dairy cattle are Holsteins, and 90% of layers are white leghorns. Going back to August Lee's point, he said since 1900, 86% of the apple varieties have gone extinct, as well as 50% of the livestock breeds in Europe and 1,000 breeds of cattle and poultry globally. 20% of animal breeds are in danger of extinction. 1 traditional breed dies each month somewhere in the world. And 4/5 of the maize varieties present in Mexico in 1930 are extinct. And he said within the last century, 75% of our plant diversity has been lost, which is pretty crazy.
One thing has changed with the dairy industry, and Brennan, you can help us out here. But they're going from Holsteins, which is basically a liquid milk, more towards Jerseys and Brown Swiss and stuff like that now with higher milk fat. And that's because milk or cheese and yogurt and stuff has become more popular. Do you have any comments, Brennan?
I agree with what you said.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a change there. That number may not be correct today.
Okay. I know that 90% of that 76% is coming from 2 sires of Holstein, like 2 line breeds of Holstein.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That's a big
That's
issue.
scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I believe one of those sires is not even living anymore. Is that correct?
Cool.
Do you know?
I would believe that. I think it's all frozen sperm at this point.
Yeah. In Mexico, you can go into, especially in southern Mexico, you can go into the markets and they have like 40 different varieties of corn that you can buy. Right. And it's just so beautiful to see some of the variation. Just incredible. Okay, so let's go on.
One of the examples, which I think, Ed, you were mentioning this earlier. So I raise red poll cattle, which I think y'all already know. But those are a cross between the Norfolk beef cow, which is the lower picture here, and the Suffolk dairy, which is in the top right corner. And both of these foundational breeds are now extinct. So there is a thing called the Suffolk Trinity, which includes the Suffolk sheep, the Suffolk Punch draft horse, and it used to include the Suffolk dairy cow. But since they're extinct, the red poll has to complete that Trinity as a stand-in. I don't know. I think real life examples just kind of put it into perspective. You know, we're never going to see these animals outside of drawings and maybe black and white photographs. And I tell people all the time at the farmer's market, I said, you know, I don't want spotted pigs with giant floppy ears to become a fairy tale. Like, I want people to be able to see them in the flesh. And I think it's important. And I don't know, I hope it makes a difference, but
So tell me about, you know, one thing that when you come into a place like Kentucky, you want to look for a breed that's going to be useful to you, is you go to a breed that's in an area or some place that's very similar. And of course, Kentucky is quite similar to what you see in the United Kingdom. And when in the United Kingdom, it happened that every little hill and valley or something had its own breed at one time.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that as roads were built and all that kind of thing, that we started seeing the loss of that diversity. But what about red poll? Where's its place in modern beef cattle industry?
Yeah, it's kind of got an interesting place, I think. They haven't really decided what they want, which route they want to go with. The association has a grass-fed beef initiative. There are some farmers in the association doing 100% grass-fed beef. And then there are other people selling off calves to feedlots and things like that. I think they just made a deal last year with a feedlot that's just taking red polls now. But they're a small framed cattle, which makes them good for grass-fed operations. They have really low birth weights, but since they were originally a dual purpose cross, calves grew really quickly because their mothers were producing a good amount of milk. I think that that's one of the things that they've really lost since probably the 60s or so. And it's something that I keep saying they need to start selecting for again, is dairy qualities, because I think that that's where the strength lies, in having really good milk production and maternal instincts. So yeah, I think they're still trying to figure out which way they want to take the breed overall. And there are people doing all kinds of things with them. So.
Okay. So more of a grass-based. Well, tell me about their body size and stuff.
Yeah. So they're more along the size of like a Dexter or a Highland. Like they're fairly short, maybe a little bit taller than that. But they're going to be, a cow's going to be 800 to 1,000 pounds. Your bull's going to be 1,200, 1,400, something like that. And so they're a smaller framed animal, which is great for me.
Exactly. So especially for something like we have here with our home place meats and the roast veal, an animal that's smaller, has quicker maturing, and has greater milk production potential is something that could fit a program like that really well. So that might be good. I know there's some folks over.
Do we know how they put on that weight?
Well, they're going to put out that milk is going to add a lot of weight early on. Huh?
Well, they're dairy, so they're going to add it to their bones first, and then they're going to fill out. I mean, like, I guess it depends on how you breed for, what you breed for, but I would assume that dairy would take over and put a lot of bone mass first, and then you would go into meat production.
A lot of early growth. A lot of early
for sure.
growth. Be like taking and putting a Hereford on a Holstein or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then you get the vigor, and then you can probably balance yourself out, but who knows?
Yeah, so I'd say red poll's got some potential.
Yeah. So the values of genetic diversity, he made a point which I thought was really important. He said the loss of potentially valuable genetic information can never be recovered, which is basically what we were just talking about. Potential values, he said, restrict opportunity for future breeding, fewer external systems that are more locally adapted, possible environmental resistance. He made a couple of really interesting points, I thought, as being a reservoir for potential resistance and a reservoir of traits for organic production. And then, of course, long-term flexibility and resilience.
I have worked a lot with the Criollo cattle, and there's a lot of interest in using Criollo cattle with dairy cattle to increase heat resistance because of the hair is different on them. And so the amount of heat load that they put on. Yeah, there's a lot of variability. We talked a little bit about sheep too yesterday. And one of the things that we saw back in the 90s was we saw, spongiform encephalopathies, scrapie in sheep, especially in Europe. They were taking flocks of sheep and just piling them up and burning them because of scrapie. They were really worried about scrapie. And what they ended up doing is going back to an old breed and taking a gene out of that and putting it back into these others that made resistance to scrapies. And so now if you go buy a ram or something, you can take, and one of the things you buy is a certified gene for resistance to scrapies. Tell us more, you have more about that, Emily?
Yeah, they're just working really hard. I don't know as much about the genetic resistance to scrapie. Most of the stuff that we have talked about at like the small ruminant meetings and all is the scrapie eradication program, which is ensuring that animals are tagged from their farm of origin, so that if they end up having scrapie, they can be traced back. So that's one of the reasons that we have such issues with not being able to export any of the small ruminants here, is because we aren't a scrapie-free country. So yeah, they're definitely trying to, I know they are trying to breed the resistance. I don't know as much about the details on those breeds, but I know that they're implementing that into like genetic programs along with the scrapie eradication program and tagging all of those animals to track where they're coming from, so that you can eliminate any genetic lines of animals who are showing it, who are passing it down.
So yeah, so one of the things you can do is get a certificate that says that there is this scrapie resistant gene in your rams. And that increases the value of your rams considerably. And so, Gabe, you might know some about it too.
Not too much. I know that, we always had to tag our sheep for scrapie, and we always had to make sure when we bought wool that we had, it was coming from sheep that had been tagged. Other than that, I really don't know much about it.
Okay.
I didn't know that you had to, can you tell me just real quick, Gabe, about the wool buying? I didn't know with wool buying that you had to have, like, you had to buy from tagged animals. That's interesting to me.
That may just be a policy that we're taking from our just for our wool mill, because for whatever reason we just take the scrapie tag number. We also take their ear tag number if they have an independent ear tag for the farm. That way we can just kind of tie back what wool is coming from what wool, or if we have any like biosecurity hazard with the wool, we can also tie that back to the farm and the animal.
Oh, cool. Okay, that makes sense.
Essentially, here in the United States, is that you cannot, an animal cannot leave the farm, a sheep anyway, cannot leave the farm unless it has a scrapie tag. So no transportation, you can't take it to the auction, or you can't process them without that scrapie tag. Yep. And the USDA APHIS will give them to you for free.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they'll just send them to you, and they'll send you two different kinds. They'll send you the regular tag, just a yellow tag that says what your farm number is. And then the other one that they're sending now is the radio frequency ID tags. So both kinds of tags. In fact, that's what we use. Instead of buying our own tags, we get the free ones and just use those. Save some money. Yep.
They're great for record keeping and like keeping track of stuff. They're just great to have.
Right. Good. Next one.
Okay. So then he went on to talk about greater genetic vulnerability. Said modern breeders tend to alter and narrow a variety's genome by focusing on one or a few genotypes in that variety, which makes crops more vulnerable. Genetic vulnerability, susceptibility to the narrowed stock to pests, diseases, and weather extremes. And like we mentioned earlier, pests and diseases are readily able to adapt to host defenses or human intervention. So herbicides, all of that, all of those things. We're breeding for specific traits opposed to overall fitness. And then going back to what Brennan mentioned, he had the example of the Irish potato blight, where farmers were depending on 2 potato genotypes, and they ended up losing 50% of their crop to blight in 1846.
There's a lot of variation too. If you go to Peru, there's just, it changes with elevation. It's just a tremendous amount of variation. Did you go there, Gabe, when you were at Ecuador? Did you go to Peru?
Yeah, I've been to Peru.
Yeah, it's just amazing that when I was there, the variation in potatoes. It's the kind of potatoes I hadn't even imagined that could happen.
Oh, right. I helped a farmer in Ecuador once plant some potatoes, and they were really pretty, like yellow with pink spot ones. They were really interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting potatoes over in Ecuador and Peru.
So dependence on human intervention. He said every hybrid has a package of inputs: cultivation, irrigation, soil amendments, fertilizer, pest control, and so on. He made the point that farmers have to increase production to offset these new additional costs. And he brought up the point that it's a loss of traditional knowledge, a loss of genetic diversity, and cultural experience.
So the traditional knowledge is something that really, it's not genetic diversity per se, but it is kind of diversity in how we think about things. I think that's a tremendous loss as well.
So loss of other genetic resources. He talked about the natural ecosystem surrounding the agroecosystem, particularly wild relatives of crop plants, crops and breeds of minor economic importance, and then beneficial non-crop organisms. He gave a couple of examples, trees and soil microbes and things like that. And he said loss of farming habitat can be more devastating than narrowing the gene pool of the crop itself.
Okay. Anybody have any comments about that? That last sentence has a lot of stuff written in it.
Mm-hmm.
What does he mean there? August, do you have any idea what he's talking about? Jennifer? What's he mean by that last sentence?
I think that it really means that you can have all the genetic diversity that you have, but if you don't have somewhere an agroecosystem for it to grow, then what good is it?
Okay, that's right. So you've lost that place that's become adapted to.
What I mean, isn't it like a shot at
anybody else?
Itself? Like it's all about how if we continue down the path of what we're doing and destroying and erosion, global warming, which is a word I hate to use, but it is warming. Climate extremes are going from one to the other. You can have as much genetic diversity as you want, but there's not going to be something that fits that wild swing of temperatures from 70 degrees to 40 degrees in a day or two. You might have it in genetic diversity, but you might lose it.
So just here in Henry County, the change in soil fertility. It'd be one issue. The fertility's changing. Soil loss here in Henry County is really, really great. You can see it right now.
Yeah, when we lose all of the ridge tops that are growing the 4 major crops, I mean, what are we going to do then?
Yeah. Good points. Anybody else?
I think one of the factors that I think about also with that sentence is, looking at the monocultures that are coming in, and the wildlife and the diversity of pollinators, not only bees. I mean, all the different, all the different life that normally exists in an area before humans come in and, plant that massive field of corn or soybeans.
Right.
And it disturbs the, the ecosystem.
Yep.
So.
Anybody else have? That's such a good point. Real good point. Hannah? Oh, she went away. Okay. Preservation. This is where we got to start thinking.
Yeah. So basically along the lines of what y'all were just saying, he says that it has to include the whole system. That it can't just be your garden plot, or it can't just be one species, but it has to be your whole farm, the area surrounding your farm. It has to include everything. And then he talked about different types of resistance. Vertical resistance is being resistant to one thing, whereas horizontal resistance is more durable. It's just kind of general hardiness or fitness. How to breed durable resistance by using open pollinated and locally adapted land braces. And they're very responsive to local skin pressure, and they have the best average performance.
What I did is, which is basically our lab for this week, is I put up on our Facebook. So I made a Facebook page for us. And it's basically, this is what the question is. What can we do here in Henry County? And one of the issues is just marketing, right? How do we take and make sure that we can make money by doing different breeds or different varieties, those kind of things. So this is something we can address through the week then on our on our Facebook page for this class. This is really important. Offsite conservation.
Yeah, so he talked about gene banks, and he mentioned in a later paragraph that that's static preservation. So, if we're saving seed from 2020 or say we have seed saved from 1920, what's that going to look like if we plant it next year? Or if we're saving seed in 2020, what's that going to look like 100 years from now? What's the world going to look like? Are these seeds going to be viable when we actually need them? He also brought up the point that they're focused mostly on high production crops, and they have a pretty limited geographic reach. So, it's not like everybody gets to contribute. It's not like I can call up a seed vault and say, hi, I have a green bean that I think you should include, like that. And so it kind of depends on who you are, and what you grow, on if your seed gets in these banks.
Also with that, sorry, Rachel, but
no, go ahead.
Talk about who's allowed to be contributing to these seed banks. I don't know if anyone in this group posted on Facebook, but it might have been another one of my friends. There was just recently, within the past 2 months, there was an indigenous group that was the first group to be allowed to put their seeds in the seed bank in Norway.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. The ARS has 5 different locations in the United States that are just seed banks. So one in the southeast, one for the west. So I can't remember where the other 3 are, but Um, so there's a lot of other seed banks besides the one in Norway. Tell us about this, your experience with this hog genetics.
Yeah. So last summer I got invited to a clinic up at Purdue that was put on by Purdue and the USDA. And there was a whole session on this exact topic. And they were basically talking about a lot of times when you register pigs, you notch their ears. And they are wanting breeders to send in these little pieces of skin to the USDA for them to save. And especially thinking through like African swine fever and things like that. They're like, we know it sounds really crazy, but if something like this is like post-apocalyptic, like coronavirus type talk, that, you know, if there are literally no more pigs, we'll be able to clone pigs from these things. They'll come out to your farm and collect semen for free if they can have it and put it in their bank. And I'm like, okay, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Like, I understand how that all works. But sending in like pieces of your pig for them to potentially grow new pigs, like, then is it my pig? Is it your pig? Like, I don't know how I feel about that. So I haven't sent anything in. But it was just really interesting concept. And when it's a big tangled thing to try to decide if you want to participate or not. But
yeah, that sounds interesting. Getting into owning genetics is an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So then he was talking about on-site conservation, which they talked a lot about that at Purdue as well. They're doing a lot of breeding there for the large black hogs and artificial insemination with some semen that they imported. So that's really what they were talking about. But so on-site conservation, it's ongoing. It's maintaining and strengthening local land races. And it allows you to mimic conditions for future cultivation. So thinking through climate change, you know, you can really start thinking ahead and selecting for, so in Kentucky, for warmer and wetter years. And he said that farms become repositories of genetic information and farmers become repositories of cultural knowledge and care. And I really liked that, that aspect that he put in there. And he mentioned that this can be done at a regional level. So if you have like screening criteria, as long as each farm is using the same criteria, you can just exchange seeds or stock between farms without one person necessarily having to do everything. And he made one point that I thought was really interesting that I didn't really know where else to put. But he said non-crops are potential new crops.
There is a lot. I mean, a lot of plants that we don't
point.
use that could be used as crops. And that's something we're learning about now, about some of the plants that were used by indigenous cultures here in Kentucky that could possibly be used more so in our general food subsystem. So that's kind of interesting.
So he just had one closing quote, which I really liked. He said, the diversity of crop varieties and livestock breeds developed by farmers and breeders over thousands of years are a resource and legacy that belong to all human beings.
And I think Steve's talking about the issue of owning, looking at what Monsanto has done, and something about being able to own essentially different kinds of life.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. Tell us about your spots here. Your picture.
Oh, yeah. So this is my breeding herd of Gloucester Old Spots. So I have a trio from Wisconsin in there, and then I have a mother and daughter in there as well. So that was really exciting for me to be able to bring one of our own pigs back that we had bred on our farm. And yeah, I've got pigs in Texas now and Wisconsin and Ohio, and have people calling me all the time wanting more breeding stock, which is great. So yeah, I think for us, I think the breeding and conservation aspect is at least equally, if not more important right now, than selling meat at the farmer's market. And when you talk about marketing and things like that, I always tell people to find their leverage. And this is one thing that we're doing that most farms in our area aren't doing. They might be using some heritage breeds, but they're crossing, or they might not necessarily be selling breeding stock. I tell people, I say 1 in 5 livestock breeds are in danger of going extinct. When people think about extinction, you think about polar bears and, seals and stuff. You don't think about pigs and cows. And so I tell our customers, I say, when you're buying pork from us, I said, you're supporting our efforts, and you're supporting, the more people eat these animals, the more people are going to raise them, the more we get to breed, and the more we can select better animals to sell to other breeders around the country. So
those of us that are consumers have a responsibility as well. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Good. I don't know if there's much time, but I was going to take and go from that. So read the chapter. That was a very nice presentation, and thank you so much, Rachel, for doing that. Our next person is Lizzie. And so you think that you're the one on species interactions in crop communities? We can work together. I can help you out with that.
Yeah, is it possible to make a PowerPoint on your phone?
I made this one on my phone on Google Slides.
Okay, then yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah, just get the Google Slides app, and you can get the Google Drive app, and it's good. It'll keep you fully connected.
Perfect.
Excellent. What I did here is I downloaded it from Google and then put it in, I think, the one we have here in Apple. So they go back and forth real easy. I always wanted, if we have time, and I wanted to show you a little bit about some work that I had done on conservation. I just picked this out of some presentations that I had. This is probably, 2009 or something like that. I did this primarily because Rachel had just got some Piney Woods cattle, or no, it was
yeah,
Piney Woods
yep.
cattle. And so I spent quite a bit of time studying, almost 10 years studying those kind of cattle. And I went all around the world looking at different, from the Philippines to Algeria, looking at this kind of cattle. And so I thought I'd go through it really quick and use one of these presentations. Ganado is cattle, so cattle of the desert. And so I'm going to go through and look at some of the history. The research I was doing was to look at what, here's an animal that had been in the southwestern United States for 450 years. And so what kind of adaptations did that mean? And I was, especially since a lot of my work was in foraging behavior. And of course, the foraging behavior is a result of the differences in physiology. A lot of my work that I had written about was about how the vegetation has changed in the desert during the last 7,000 years. And one of the reasons things has happened is that a lot of the desert, the northern Chihuahuan desert, had been in grasslands, and then it's moved in shrublands, since people saw that as being very negative. So we wanted to take and understand that. And if we couldn't really understand it using Herefords and Angus cattle, because during that change, it was this old Spanish cattle that was there. So we thought we could better understand it if we had that type of animal that was there at the time. And then we also wanted to look at new systems of beef cattle production systems that might be applicable today. So that's what we're looking at. Criollo cattle. Criollo just means that it's Spanish, but it was born in the New World. Okay. And so Criollo cattle first came to the New World in 1493 on Columbus's second voyage. And all those cattle went to a place called Hispaniola. And that's the Dominican Republic there now, and in Cuba. So been in the New World since 1493. They originally came from the Atlas Mountains. And so the earliest where we see the relationship between people and cattle is in a site in Algeria. It's about 7,600 years old. And so if you look at, these are some pictures that I took in Algeria, and you can see how they look a lot like your animals. They have that same body style and everything to them. And so that's where they came from. They went from Spain, and in Spain, what they did is they got really mixed up because they had, at that time, Queen Isabella was trying to get rid of all the Moors. And so Spain was at war with itself. And so a lot of things were getting mixed up. And so when Columbus had made that voyage and he loaded up in Grenada with cattle, it was kind of a mix of cattle. It wasn't something that was just in one locale. Here is Hispaniola. Can you see the cursor? They first went to Hispaniola. They did really well. And then they started taking, and as they went to Mexico, they moved to Mexico into what's now the United States. I don't have a picture of the ones that went to Florida, the Piney Woods cattle, but that was in about 1517 is when those animals first went to the United States. So they have been in what's now Florida and clear to Louisiana for, what is that? How many years is that? About 400 some years. And so they have become very, very adapted. If I took some of my animals that came from Chihuahua here, and I took and put those over in Florida, they wouldn't do very well. And so there's become a lot of local adaptation. I don't think that my cattle that I have here in Chihuahua would do very well here in Kentucky. And so I've not brought any here. But if I was to bring a Criollo type animal, I would go to Florida or to Louisiana and bring in the Piney Wood type. That would be that's a great choice, actually. Over in, what happened is in about 1517, cattle came into Mexico, and within 40 years, they completely dominated the central region of Chihuahua, or of Mexico. This is the central plateau of Mexico. Then they couldn't use the meat. There was no real need for meat. So what they did is they killed them. They took the hides, and hides are really what they sold. But there was some, within 40 years, there was some ranches, rancheros, that had something like 50, 60,000 head. And of course, a lot of them got away. Here's some, this is some pictures of cattle from the Jornada, and you can see the influence. Here is, or it says 1919. You can see the shape of the head and the shape of the horns. It shows that what they called the old Chihuahuas, which was a Criollo influence. And then they started breeding in more Hereford cattle, and you can start seeing the change more to a kind of a Hereford. They really didn't like the scrub cattle that the Chihuahuas represented at the time. The issue was, though, that when they had hard times, those old Chihuahua cattle never died. The Hereford cattle would die like flies in those cases. So this is the Jornada experimental range then, with a lot with that Chihuahua type cattle with a more Hereford influence. Here's some work that I did over in Baja California. Everybody know where Baja California is? We did some transect that started up here in the center part of Baja and went down to La Paz. And we looked at the changes. And what happens is the Criollo cattle up here around San Ignacio were a lot smaller. And this is a place where the rainfall amounts like 3 to 6 inches a year. And then we get down to La Paz and it's up over 20 inches. And so what you see is since 1680, when the cattle came in here, and what we call these cattle here is Chinapo, they have changed. There's been a lot of local variation occur during all that time. So the same kind of thing that we saw in the UK or different places where you start seeing breeds start forming. And here's the kind of issue. This is what people that are raising those animals. This is an animal you can see right here. This is all cactus. It's just sticking to them. They're eating cactus and what they call a pitaya, spreading seeds all over the place. So they probably changed a lot. See, here's some pitaya here. And you can see there's not much there. This is a bad year. And this animal was probably being milked. So it was providing cheese for this ranchero. So this is an animal from the northern part, and this is the one from the southern. You can see the difference in flesh and body size. Here's where I did a lot of my work. These animals are mine. As I was pulling them out, I took and went in and to Chihuahua, and I was down in the Sierra Tarahumara, this area right here. And I went and I selected beef type animals instead of animals. So what happened is people had gone in there and they selected animals that were good for roping. But what they did is they bred those so that they stayed small all the time so they could rope them longer. I wanted one that was be more of a beefy. If it got more feed, it would grow faster and those kind of things. So I wanted one that would grow. And so I went down and I went from one ranchero to another and looking at the animals that they had. I did it from the bottom of the canyon. So the canyon goes from like 120 feet up to 9,000 feet. And you'll see changes in the animals, the type of animals with the elevation. Here, these are the ones from lower in the canyon. And these are the Tarahumara people in the top of the canyon. And they have been the keepers of these breeds for a long time, especially in the northern or the upper regions of the canyon. And again, there's quite a bit of variability in them. I would say that there's some breed differences within the Criollo. Lots of variation. This is, again, part of the area. We did a lot of genetic testing here. Did a lot of genetic testing. I went to the Philippines to do that, in Spain, in Algeria. And so we collected blood, and we have a paper out on some of the variation of these Criollo. Here's one of the things that were happening is the Hereford and the Angus were valued more, and so they were selling genetics to the people in this region, and so we were starting to see these Criollo influence disappear. The problem was that too, it was creating a hardship because these bigger animals couldn't make it on their own as much, and so you saw families trying to make decisions about whether I feed my cows or do I feed my family. Where they never had that choice before, when they didn't have to make that choice when they had just Criollo animals. So we really did those people a disfavor by bringing in these new genetics. This is we're testing here for TB. This is myself and Alfredo. This guy here, we called him Hollywood. He could speak some English. He had actually been in California for a few weeks, I guess. But he was a character, and he helped us buy cattle in that region. Here's a way to bring them out of the bottom of the canyon. This, we were putting them in the back of this Jeep, and this Jeep had no brakes. No brakes at all. So it was quite an adventure doing that. This is just some of the health records. We had to keep them in, create a herd, and it took me a year before I could cross them into the United States. I was the first person in 30-some years that had brought breeding cattle into the United States. Here's some more. This is the animals that we collected. We're taking them down. I put them on the train here. And we rode the railroad out. This is the last private railroad or Mexican railroad in Mexico now. And these are the old cattle cars. When I rode these out of the mountains, we had people just all over these cattle cars riding the train for free. It was really a kind of an interesting experience. Here's this is Tamoras. This is where we boarded the train. And so we brought them out. This is closer to Chihuahua City. And when we got there, nobody showed up. And so here I am with all these cattle and nowhere to take them so I had to wait a while before we could take and actually move them. But yeah, this is how we got them there. And this is an area, this is actually a facility that Temple and I worked on. About 90% of all the cattle it's grown in the northern part of Mexico comes into the United States and is fed. And somewhere about 90% of those cattle cross here at Santa Teresa before they go to feedlots and stuff up into Texas. So this is San Geronimo. And so this is where we crossed our animals. There's huge stories behind all of this. And then we pick, and this is Octavio. I think some of you have talked about Octavio. Octavio and I still work together, just as some of my other grad students. And we worked both in Mexico and in the United States, looking at things like foraging behavior, differences in physiology, and those kind of things. And at that time, one of my issues was I couldn't take and feed these cattle and put them into the commercial system. So I had to figure another way to do it. This is, again, some of the research. So I had to figure out another way, and that's really I got interested in local meat, locally adapted meat, and direct sales to the consumer. Here's some more of that research. Here's Octavio again. This is some research we did up on the Hornada experimental range. Here's Octavio as well. Here's some work that we did on diet selection, where we'd send animals out and we would take everything out of the rumen and we'd send them out to eat for a couple hours, bring them back in and take out what they just ate and then put back what was originally into the rumen. And you can see it's a lot sparser forage than we have here in Kentucky. So it's quite a bit different. Disease resistance. One of the things we see is that these animals are more resistant to flies and several diseases that affect animals in the desert. We saw an increase in digestive efficiency. They select a completely different diet, much different than what we saw with our Angus and our Hereford mixes. And we saw some differences in grazing behavior. I believe I have a slide here on that. Here's a pasture. This is my smallest pasture at the Hornada. It's 1,200 acres. And you can see this is during the summertime. And this one with the blue, that's my black baldies. That's an Angus Hereford cross. And that's all the further they would move. But my Criollo cattle would cover that whole pasture. What this happens in this situation here with the blue is that you get local overgrazing here and you get undergrazing out in the extremes. And so we're trying to figure out how to use those pastures better without just fencing everything. It was too expensive to keep fencing it. And so one of the ways is just to go to a different animal. And so our Criollo, they covered a lot more land, a lot better. We noticed there's heat tolerance. We were able to, on just rangeland there in that situation, we were able to breed at an earlier age most of our heifers. Without any supplementation at all, the Angus cattle that we used in comparison, some of them about half of them never did breed in those kind of conditions. Calving ease was really, we just haven't had any problems with calving ease at all in these animals that we've seen in some of our others. And they have a much different social dynamic. I think part of it's because of the horns. But they have there's a lot more distance between animals than we had in our Angus Hereford crosses. What else? That's a different subject. And I think that pretty much covers it. One of the things I had, though, when I first started with these animals is I could take and use them for sport. One of the biggest sports in the Southwest is team roping. And so people would pay me $25 a month to take animals for team roping. And not only that, but they fed them for me. So that was a real advantage. And then I could take and turn around and sell those animals, usually for hamburger. This steak is not from one of my Criollo animals, but right now everything that we raise is going either to bulls or to restaurants or to retail markets. And so, and the issue that we're having right now with this is more animals are going to be sold in Chihuahua and fewer in the United States. And that's so what I'm trying to do is get other producers who bought bulls from me to take and meet the needs of the restaurants and retailers that I've been working with over the years. So, but anyway, these are the similar kind of animals that Rachel just bought. And but these are more desert adapted animals than the Criollo type animals in the piney woods. And they really they take on some real harsh country like nothing else. It's incredible. I think I'm probably about over time. No, I'm really close. Any questions or anything?
No, I'm good, Ed. Thanks.
You bet. I'm going to send you here a quiz that you can take and do it. It's an open book quiz. If you could send it back to me here in the next day, I would appreciate it. See here, where did I put it? Before noon tomorrow is what I asked for. And so if you could do that, I would appreciate it. Also, I have on our some questions for our lab about what we might be able to do to preserve some of these genetics on our Facebook page. Okay. And so the way I was going to grade that is just participation.
Okay.
People who participate and stuff gets full credit.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for, you made a first day really easy. So I appreciate it.
Good job, Rachel.
Oh, thanks, y'all.
Great. That was good. Okay, you guys, any questions at all?
No.
Don't think so.
I guess you got to go join Leah in her class next, huh?
Yeah.
So strange.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll see you tomorrow.
Alrighty. Thanks,
ya.
Ed.
Bye.
Take care.
Ew.